Welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. Very warm welcome to everyone, whether you're listening on YouTube or on the digital networks. I hope you enjoy today's show. We're going to be looking at some articles that we've seen in the news, and I'm going to be joined by Anthony Kay and Phil Gardner. And remember, you can contribute articles for these chat discussion shows we have once or twice a month. You can leave some links in the chat box on our website at www.truthsentinel.co.uk. You can also leave voicemails there and we can put them on the show and respond to them. So that's www.truthsentinel.co.uk. Much of what we're going to talk about today is going to be connected to technology, the future and neurology. I was reading about driverless cars the other day and how they're going to affect society, and they're going to become the norm in the coming years. I suppose with these technological advancements there are some advantages, but there's also some disadvantages. I mean, who are you going to complain to if a driverless car cuts you up on the road? And who are you going to talk to if you order a taxi and you're on a long journey? Not that you always want to talk to someone, by the way. I suppose at least if the driverless car is programmed to chat to you, you can tell it to shut up without feeling too impolite. Of course, it also opens the possibility to assassinations, and some would argue that's already taken place or possibly may have taken place. Look at the case of Michael Hastings, whose car crashed at high speed inexplicably. Some have argued that his car may have been taken over or hacked into. Those possibilities are certainly going to become easier with driverless cars. What's your opinion about driverless cars anyway? Do you think it's progress, or do you think it's a bad idea? It certainly could put a lot of people out of work. Taxi driving is a skill that a lot of people can achieve, and it's an easy source of income for some people, either officially or unofficially. So it's certainly going to affect the job market. But what's your opinion anyway about driverless cars? Drop me an email or leave a message in the chat room or leave a voicemail. Okay, anyway, let's move on. So settle down, relax, and enjoy today's show. So let's go over to Anthony now, 1,500 meters above sea level, at the foothills of the origins of the Himalayas, near the highest ice rink in the world, in Almaty, Kazakhstan. Anthony, how's things going?
Hi, Scott, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's another sunny day here in Koh Samui in Thailand. Things could be a lot worse. Not much going on, no major news to report, but talking of news, I know you've got an article you wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, I've got a few things I want to talk about, but I wanted to start by mentioning something that caught my eye in the media this week. It's a story about cats, which we all know are the real purpose of the internet. But to get to the cats, we have to go via a very interesting neurological disorder known as Capgras syndrome. And patients who have this disorder generally believe their loved ones have been replaced by replicas, usually with some kind of evil purpose.
A bit like the body snatchers.
A bit like, actually, quite a lot like the body snatchers. There was a famous case of Capgras in the late 1980s involving a patient called Mr. A. He was a 37-year-old man, and he'd become... Not
related to Mr. B, is he?
He could be. I believe that they are actually carpooling these days. Okay. But he'd become convinced that all of his family members had died, and they'd been replaced by clones whose bodies had then been taken over by spirit. The thing is, Mr. A also suffered from other psychological problems, which is very often the case with this Capgras syndrome. It seems to kind of piggyback on other mental illnesses. So he was a diagnosed schizophrenic, and he'd been in and out of mental institutions for years. And as the syndrome progressed, he started hearing voices, and the voices told him that the spirit which controlled his father's body had killed his brother and put a clone in his place. And yeah, so this is where Capgras can become a very dangerous disorder, because ultimately Mr. A decided to shoot his father, and he did. He killed him.
I thought it was going to be a nice, light-hearted story.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We will get to the cats eventually. He then went out searching for his other relatives, and while he was looking for them, he just ran across a young man on the street and concluded that the young man was also a clone, and he was in on this conspiracy. So he shot that guy as well, not fatally, luckily. Then Mr. A was arrested. He went on trial, and he was, acquitted by reason of insanity. He ended up, locked in a psychiatric facility, where, as far as I know, he still is, kind of taking antipsychotics to keep him calm and so on. So it's an illness that can have very serious consequences, obviously, and those patterns that death is a fairly serious consequence. Yeah, the patterns that I've just described, especially the delusion that, these doubles who've replaced your loved ones. This seems to be a common element of kæp'ɡrɑः cases. But look, what caught my attention this week was the very strange case of a man who believed his cat had been taken away by the FBI and replaced with a replica cat which was spying on him. It's not entirely clear whether this is a case of Capgras syndrome or not, but it certainly looks that way. Again, the man had a history of mental illness. He was bipolar. He'd sustained some slight brain injuries early in his life while he was playing competitive hockey, and he was obsessed with the idea that he was being watched. His wife reported that he would often, pass her written notes in the house to tell her, the house is being monitored. We have to talk, using notes and things like this. So many of the signs are there. And in fact, once this story broke, it became clear that it wasn't a unique case. There have been several instances in the past where people that have believed that their cats, their dogs, even their pet birds have been replaced by these replicas, often by government agencies. Now, what interested me so much about the story, though, is two things actually. First is, we can sort of laugh at the guy with his FBI cat because it is quite sort of funny and
trying not to.
Well, yeah, it is quite funny and quirky, unlike the tragic Mr. A case. But actually, it does bring up some serious issues, and the first one is, could something like that actually happen in the real world? What I mean is, we can be pretty certain that in this guy's case, it is a delusion, because he has a mental history, and he's shown all the classic symptoms of paranoia. But can we imagine a case where someone identifies another person as a plant, and actually, they are a plant? I don't know, but I wouldn't entirely rule it out, which of course might mean that I'm mentally ill myself.
Must have been cases where people have said they're being followed, and they've got stalkers, and people have thought they're paranoid, but later on found out that they were being followed.
Yeah, I think it's really a case of, how bizarre are you prepared to admit, that reality can get.
Well, I'm sure also somebody could set someone up to make them think they're going mad as well, and make other people think that person's going mad.
Yeah, another possibility. It's that one's actually, beloved of many, or was beloved of many classical writers. I think even Shakespeare had a plot line like that in one of his plays. But that's the other thing that draws me to cases like this is I think we all suffer delusions at times. The brain is a very powerful thing, and it can make the world look a certain way, and it can do that so convincingly that we can be entirely fooled by our own delusions. But the interesting part, I think, is that most of us aren't going out there, looking for our brothers, trying to shoot them because they've been replaced by clones. So the obvious conclusion, I think, is that there's a kind of spectrum, with completely sane, rational behavior and rational beliefs at one end, and totally debilitating delusions at the other end. And I would say we're all sitting somewhere on that spectrum with what you might call, an acceptable level of delusion.
What about the delusion that everything's okay?
Well, that is, of course, an extremely serious one. Yeah, if it doesn't have a clinical name yet, it really needs one. Or
the delusion that Hillary Clinton would make a good president.
Yeah, the delusion that because she says something, she actually means it. It's bizarre. But yeah, I think these things are, when I say an acceptable level of delusion. It's acceptable because it means we believe things that aren't true, but they aren't so huge that they make us unable to function properly, or they aren't so huge that they make us go out and try to kill people, right?
Well, the other thing is one person's delusion is another person's fact. So who's right? Is it the person telling you that you're deluded, or is the person that's being told they're deluded actually correct, and the person who's saying it's a delusion is not correct? So it is very difficult to work out.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's also very difficult, I think, to work out where we are on the spectrum between, being completely rational and being completely deluded.
For example, if we link this to conspiracy theories, there are many people in the truth movement that believe in chemtrails, and to be honest, I'm open-minded to it, and I've certainly seen a difference between what most planes seem to leave behind them and ones and trails that are really thick and that stay there for ages, and you sometimes see crisscrossing. So I'm open-minded to it, but I'm not a total believer in it because I just don't know. I really have no idea. But there are many people who do. Is that a delusion? When how do we know something is a delusion? Are these people who believe in chemtrails deluded, or are people who don't believe in them? They don't have enough information to realise that it's true, that the chemtrails scenario is a fact.
Well, that's right, and I think it's particularly difficult because it's very difficult for another person to change your belief. Yeah. So in terms of where you are on the kind of delusion spectrum, it's your own brain which has put you there, and your brain is the organ organ that you use to understand the world. So how on earth are you meant to know where you are on this delusion spectrum in the first place?
I think there is a difference, though, between a delusion and an opinion. If you believe in chemtrails because you've studied all the facts and you've come to the conclusion this is a valid scenario and this is happening, I don't think that's a delusion. People can't turn around to you and say you're deluded if you've examined all the facts and come up with an opinion. So that's my thinking behind things. Is doesn't matter how crazy the concept. If you've done the research and thought about it logically, well, at least you've put in some effort, So it's not. That's the difference between a delusion where you haven't really based your opinion on any kind of facts and you've arrived at a conclusion that many people would find a bit suspect.
True, but I don't think this is in any way specific to the truth movement. What I'm saying is I think we are all, every person is somewhere along that spectrum, and trying to find out. And obviously, people who go out and kill their fathers because they think that they've implanted a clone inside their brothers are on an unacceptable place on the spectrum. So, but the difficulty, I think, for all of us is to understand where we are there on the spectrum in the first place. And I think that's an extremely important and an extremely complex question. So, yeah, the man with the FBI cat, I think, just throws that question out there. And I don't know that anyone's really been able to answer it yet.
And it's worth pointing out that probably within the next sort of 20, 30, 40 years, there will be cats, synthetic cats that are able to spy on people, and I'm sure there are kind of, like you see in James Bond, those kind of technology factories where they're making all these gadgets and things that all the spies can use. I'm sure at some point they will be making things that are supposed to be organic, which actually double up as spying mechanisms. I mean, they already use kind of fake animals in when they're filming for wildlife programs to get good video of creatures in their natural habitat. So why not with humans too?
Yeah, who knows? It may well be. It may well be indeed, because it would be a very effective disguise. I think I'd probably have to go for a Venus flytrap. What do you think?
Yeah,
that would just it'd be sort of poetic, I think.
I think mosquitoes. I think mosquitoes would be quite handy, and they actually. I mean, we have looked at those before. They've made some. They are working on mosquito drones, allegedly.
Yeah. But there was something else that I wanted to talk about as well. Do you remember a while ago chatting about how the Audi automotive company were planning to put a moon lander on the moon?
I do recall you mentioned it before, yeah.
So it's happening, or it's happened. Last month they launched it in a marketing sense, not in a sending it into space sense. And it's part of this Google Lunar Xprize. There are 29 teams competing to send a craft to the moon. Honestly, I am just a tiny little bit worried about this for a couple of reasons.
Before you give us your reasons, shall we bring in Phil? So, welcome back, Phil.
Hi there, Scott. Hi, Anthony. Good to be back.
Hello.
And let's just get on with the show today, because we've been having technical problems, and if we ignore them, maybe they'll go away. So, Phil, let's just have a quick recap on what everyone's going to talk about today. I'll start with myself, and then we'll go to Anthony, then Phil. So I'm just going to mention a few things in passing, plus maybe talk about one or two things. I'm going to be talking about meteorites, North Korea, Julian Assange, and sex robots. How about you, Anthony?
Well, as I mentioned at the start, there is this Google Lunar X moon competition, which I thought might be interesting to chat about.
Okay, yeah, we'll come back to you on that in a second. And Phil, how about yourself?
And I was just going to chat about criminal minds. There's some it's not really new technology, but they're basically scientists are using kind of neuroscience and brain scans to perhaps predict whether criminals will reoffend and start using it in the law courts. So I kind of wanted to talk about this a little bit.
And I saw that link you posted on our website, which has been nicely updated by Anthony Kay. So I invite everyone to go and check that out, www.truthsentinel.co.uk. You can find most of the links to things we chat about in the chat room there. And remember, there's a voicemail in there, so you can always comment on some of the subjects we've talked about as well. But let's go over to you, Anthony, with your topic that you'd started talking about.
Yeah. So just to resume, basically, this Google Lunar Xprize has been up and running for a while. About 30 teams are competing to put a craft on the moon. Most recently, the Audi Motor Company has unveiled its entry, and it seems to be one of the front runners. And look, what worries me about this is a couple of things. Firstly, the news is all good. I mean to say that I cannot find any kind of serious doubts being expressed about this. And it's the kind of thing which normally you would expect to spark some fairly intense ethical debate. The reason why I think it should be sparking some debate is that there are a whole bunch of agreements about the moon and what can be done with the moon, but they're kind of loose. There is one called the Moon Agreement, for example, but Russia, the US, and China have not signed up to it. So the moon is kind of there's some sort of general international conventions that say very, very non-specific things like, people can only use the moon for peaceful purposes and so on. But basically,
that one won't last very long, Anthony.
Well, no. I think Google is in a position where if this really takes off from a PR perspective, it might serve them well to actually stake a little claim on the moon, which could be the beginning of privatization of a celestial body. And I think that is huge, and I'm disturbed that more people, or any people pretty much, aren't commenting on it.
I think it's because there seems to be a fairly passive population at the moment. People just don't seem to care about anything. Maybe that's a bit negative. I just felt like I felt that regarding situations like Julian Assange, which I'll mention later as well. It's just like it just seems like people don't really care that much about major issues. Hasn't China already sent some probes to the moon and things like that, though? It seems like it's every man for himself, really.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it. I think the danger of this Lunar X competition is that, as I say, there are about 30 teams participating. And of course, one of the first things they're going to do, I was reading about an Australian team participating with a project they're calling the Lunar Numbat. And the first thing they're going to do when they get up there is plant an Australian flag. Now, that's just lunacy. That is, just asking for trouble.
Well, you said it's lunacy, and that word is derived from the word lunar, which pertains to the moon. But that's not very patriotic of you, Anthony. You're Australian.
I am, but I certainly wouldn't like to think that any Australian team is going to plant an Australian flag on the moon, because then you're entrusting that bit of the moon to the Australian Parliament, which is just insane. But also, I even more than that, I wouldn't want to entrust any of the moon to Google.
It won't be long before the moon is a Death Star. You know it's going to happen. What do you think, Phil?
Uh-huh.
It kind of worries me, like Anthony, it worries me when anyone kind of thinks of staking a claim on anything at the moment, especially on like you say, a celestial body. Because it reminds me of the sort of the Wild West frontier, 150 years ago, when the west of America was sort of being slowly colonized. And it was like, there were some crazy things, you kind of had these races where people would all line up on horses or in their chariots and carts and so on. And someone would fire a gun and then they'd be off, and they'd be off with their flags, ready to sort of plant them wherever they could stake a claim. And it's like, it's kind of taking something that's never really going to belong to you. It can't possibly, the moon cannot possibly belong to a country or an organization. It's like that organization is going to die before the moon does. So it seems a bit, again, like we're repeating a bit of insanity.
We've already done it to the Earth, basically. I mean, governments control most of the Earth now. In most places in the world now, you can't pitch a tent unless it's a designated area. The whole of the Earth has been basically, it's under someone's control, and it's kind of silly, really. We're all occupants of this planet. Certain people have elevated to the top and are now in control of areas and in control of us, really. Anyway, Phil, how about we go to your first story?
I was looking into this article. I was actually listening to something on a podcast on the website, thenakedscientists.com, and they were looking into neuroscience and how it could be used in the courtrooms. And basically, they're asking the question of could brain scans shape prison sentences? Can it predict who will reoffend? And they were taking different neuroscientists and people who are into this research and asking them various questions on how this could work. And it just I just found it an interesting story, really. I don't know a lot about neuroscience, and I've just had this kind of increasing interest in the use of brain scans recently, over the last sort of year or so, because it's becoming more and more sort of used in scientific research and to look into kind of the nature of the human mind, the nature of emotions, and our behavior, basically. So I found this an interesting thing that it could move into our courtrooms, which is, I don't know, quite a serious thing to me. So yeah, I just found this interesting and kind of quite a serious thing that this sort of research and basically brain scans and neuroscience was going to be used in the criminal justice system. And there's still, it's not like they're trying to use it to definitely predict someone's sentence or definitely say this guy is guilty or whatever. They're still kind of in the area of research, but it's just an interesting topic for me that this came up, and reminds me of some old science fiction films like The Minority Report, for example, or Inception even.
It's very much like Philip K. Dick, Blade Runner and all of those kinds of stories.
Philip K. Dick, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I listened to some of the. It was a podcast, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I listened to some. It reminded me of a little bit of some of the issues we talked about on an episode we did on free will, and how neurology is coming into the courtroom, and I think it's concerning as well. I'm probably more concerned about this than the moon at the moment. One
of the cases they talked about was a guy. I think he was in the courts for rape, and there have been other cases of paedophiles who've been in court. And the rapist guy, I think he got off, or he got a much lighter sentence than he would have done otherwise because of his brain scan. And the brain scan sort of said that he'd basically had some head trauma when he was a child, and this can really affect the workings of the brain. And so he wasn't fully responsible for his actions. Now, I'm not sure how I feel about this. It's quite a worrying thing, because it means that some people can start using this, especially when you have fairly dodgy lawyers around who are just trying to get anyone off, get anyone the lightest sentence they possibly can, even if they know they are a criminal or they're involved in criminal activity. It's a fairly sort of worrying situation in a way.
This is something which is also really coming to light now, or over the last 10 years or so. The nexus between science and criminal justice has been a very dysfunctional one, and we're finding out now that there are a whole bunch of techniques that are standard in the courtroom now. Which came from science. Forensic evidence is one of them, and we'll talk about that later. But the science of these things starts up, and before it's fully proven, the criminal justice system grabs it and starts using it. And there was a study about reoffenders a couple of years ago. The scientists involved used fMRI scans. They scanned the brains of some prisoners to find out like how much cortical activity they had. There's a particular part of the cortex that regulates decision making, and then they followed the prisoners after they'd been released for the following 4 years, right? And they found that people with lower amounts of cortical activity were more likely to reoffend than people with higher amounts. Now, the scientists who conducted this experiment said straight out, this is really not ready to go. This is very much at a speculative stage. Like we're just meddling with this. We think it's promising, but we need to do a lot more work before it's anything, approaching something that you could use in a courtroom. And yet here we are just 2 years later. That study was in 2013. So here we are 2-3 years later, and it's already being used in courtrooms. And this has generally been the pattern. Science comes up with something that shows a little bit of promise, and as you said, like defense lawyers, prosecutors, police departments, they just grab it and run with it before it's anything like a proven piece of science.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very concerned about this. I think it seems to me there's neuroscience seems to be moving in the direction of absolving people of their crimes because of past events. We talked about free will, how we don't necessarily make decisions. It can be traced back to our circumstances, our genetics.
But the point is, in a case like this, it isn't the scientists who are to blame. The scientists are investigating something that they think is really interesting, and others are taking it out of their hands and using it in a way which it's not ready to be used in. I think probably the biggest opponents of that would be the scientists themselves.
Well, maybe. Well, look into that. It could be. I expect there's some that maybe scientists that there'd be courtroom scientists, won't there? There'd be people that are called in to give evidence and say whether there is any reasoning behind this. And
yeah. See, this is another thing that again has really been coming into the open in the last decade or so. Is that these courtroom scientists that you see on TV, they don't really exist in the form that we see them in the media. Many of the people who are giving evidence are not overly well trained and are employed by the criminal justice system, not by a scientific research center. So the people who really have the best idea of what's going on with a particular bit of science aren't the people who are giving the evidence, and that's part of the problem.
The difficulty for me is that when people think of science, they think of it as factual straight away almost. And so once a certain sort of scientific discovery has been made, a lot of people, just humanity in general, tends to jump on that and kind of think, fact, okay, this is solid, this is set in stone. And then maybe a few years down the line, some new scientific piece of evidence kind of adds to it or completely defuncts what had gone before, and we kind of think, man, okay, this is fact.
Yeah,
and
totally
we keep doing it again and again and again. And I'd rather humanity sort of saw science as like a process, an ongoing kind of discovery that's never really going to be set in stone. It sort of seems to be we're just uncovering layer after layer after layer of the universe, the cosmos, life, and everything else. And each layer kind of adds to, or what we discover under each layer adds to what has gone before. It's not necessarily like, oh, well, this is it. This is the truth for the, we're living in right now.
I absolutely agree with you, and I definitely think that's a healthier way to view science. I would say, in a sense, that's kind of the public's problem. And look, I've heard a lot of skepticism of science, and I share some of it. But I would also say many scientists do regard their disciplines as a process, like just as you've described. And so you have to ask, is it the fault of the scientist, or is it that the public doesn't really understand that, a scientist comes out and goes, we've discovered this, knowing that in 10 years that will be superseded, but the public decides, oh, okay, that's truth now, we're settled, we're done.
I think it's a combination of all of three things: the media, the public, and scientists. I disagree with you to a certain extent. I think there's lots of scientists who are quite arrogant out there, but that's not to say they all are. There's definitely scientists who aren't, but I think they definitely share part of the blame.
To a certain extent, there is a tendency of the mainstream media to get hold of the scientists who are the most, how can we put it, fundamentalists, let's say, and kind of elevate them. And I think that becomes misrepresentative. We seem to be dealing with a group of people who are very, set in their ways and their version of reality, because there are people like Richard Dawkins who really do approach the world like that, and he becomes a media star. But, if you compare him to many of the other people working in the same field, his ideas are a lot more set in stone than many of his colleagues. I just wanted to mention there's an article that I've just pulled up here on scienceblogs.com, and the title of the article is "Most Scientific Theories Are Wrong," and it's written by a scientist called Ethan Siegel, and Ethan explains the idea of like scientific modeling. And the idea of scientific modeling is, let's try and get better and better approximations of reality. But the idea certainly isn't, hey, here is reality now, we're done. It's definitely not that.
We did have a chat about this, or we had a little email chat about this. I would say that's very, very much an exception. That article would not be written by 95% of scientists. That the title itself is an exception.
I think you're absolutely wrong about that. Sorry.
No, it's good. It's good. No, I think that is. I mean, that's just my view. I think it's an exception.
Mm-hmm. We kind of skewed the discussion away from your topic, Phil. Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's because it kind of moves into a much bigger field, and the only other thing I was going to add to this was something that you posted, Scott, which kind of linked into the brain scan thing. It was your article about memory hacking.
Right. Yeah. About.
Did you look into that much?
I didn't, but we'll go with it. Basically, I was there was an article I saw where it was a bit like the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Scientists think they can now delete memories and also replace memories with false memories, which obviously throws up a lot of implications.
They were talking about this being used in law courts as well, not being used in law courts, but saying like there's a danger that, for example, people who are on a jury or people who are witnesses to a crime or something like that, there's a danger because they're discovering all these new things about memory and the purposes of memory. Now, I remember reading an article in National Geographic many, many years ago, and it was a psychologist who was talking about the sort of functions of memory, and he was saying, like, you're not meant to remember everything. He was saying it's really healthy for the brain to just let go of the vast majority of experiences and information that we get bombarded with every day in everyday experience. And he sort of said, so really the purpose of your brain is to dump loads of information rather than to retain it. And we're kind of taught the opposite in school. We're taught to retain all of this information and try to regurgitate it in an exam or a test or whatever. And that kind of goes against the sort of the flow of the brain. And what they found out in this this new research is that the same parts of the brain that are used to remember the past are actually used to imagine the future as well. So this is leading scientists to believe that the purpose of memory is to take past events and put them together to draw a picture of the future. And there's biological proof of that, one of these articles is saying. And it sort of says past experience basically helps people predict what they're going to do. So again, this is really interesting to me, but also I kind of think quite serious for the human race, because people are sort of saying if they have a bad memory, you know, something that's really affecting their life, they can actually erase it. And so they've been testing it on people with arachnophobia, for example. So get rid of a bad memory of some bad memory that you have of a past experience with spiders, and you can overcome this fear. But I think for many people it means like perhaps they can get rid of all of these bad memories that will no longer create any kind of bad future, I guess. So they can create a much better future for themselves. And I'm not sure that that's actually going to work. I'm not sure that's the way things go.
No, I'm not sure either. It seems to me like all the sci-fi movies that we watched when we were younger, they're all sort of coming to pass. You know.
Yeah.
It seems like we could potentially be the next sort of 50 to 100 years could be a very scary time of you know, like movies like Total Recall and things like that, and the one I already mentioned. With people erasing their memories. Imagine having false memories planted in where you think you've committed a crime as well. That was one of the examples given in the article.
Just going to say that was Dr. Julia Shaw who actually tested this on various people, and she convinced all these people that they had committed crimes, and that actually happened.
I was just going to say two things. First, that's always been the art of the science fiction writer. So it shouldn't really surprise us that some of the things we've seen in movies and read in books are coming true, because as a science fiction writer, that's exactly what you try to do. You try to think, all right, given what we know now. And I think Minority Report was a very interesting example of this. Maybe we mentioned this on the show before. Steven Spielberg assembled a team of futurologists, I think he called them, in order to get them to kind of do a bit of research and say, all right, my movie set 40 years in the future, make a list of technologies that could be true, and then eliminate them until you've got the most likely ones. And that is sort of the art of science fiction, you know. But in terms of memory implanting, we know it's possible. There's no doubt at all. On a previous episode, we've discussed the satanic ritual abuse phenomenon, and we disagreed as to whether it was a phenomenon or not. But we did agree that there were a certain number of cases, and they were not small, in which false memories were implanted. In some cases, or in many cases, in fact, unconsciously. So the person who implanted the false memories didn't even know they were doing it. It's very, very easy to manipulate the memory. It's frighteningly easy when you start to look into it. So if people get it into their heads that they want to set out to alter the memory, that's very achievable.
Absolutely.
And also kind of worrying for me, because like I was saying, if people kind of think that they can erase bad memories from the past to make a better future, I just don't think life works like that, because I actually think there's quite a good purpose behind many supposedly bad events. You know, we have bad experiences in our lives, and many of them can be awful at the time. They can be quite tragic at the time, but they don't necessarily lead to further negative experiences in the future, in our future life. I think what is conceived of as positive and negative is kind of interchangeable, like throughout life. So a negative event can actually lead later on to a positive event, which can then lead to another negative event, and then another positive, and so on. It doesn't really, one negative doesn't sort of necessarily mean it creates further negative
That's very true.
in our life.
There's a good example that I posted a video of a little girl, I think it was in Turkey, who's walking along, and she slips over and then falls flat on her face, which you could consider a negative event. But then what happened next showed that if she hadn't slipped over at that precise moment, she could well be dead. What happens? She slips over, falls down flat on her face, and then a car drives over the top of her, and then she gets up, and so she's completely unaffected. Whereas had she been standing up, there's a good chance she would have been killed. So I think, we don't always realise that some of the negative things, which could be saving our lives. You go left, you could be, or you miss a train or something, and you're late for work. All these things can have effects.
Absolutely, I've had that experience. I missed a train once by seconds. It was pulling out of the platform, and it crashed. And 7 people were killed. But I think in general terms I agree. But I wonder if there are situations that you could say are exceptions. Perhaps, for example, people who have been raped. In some circumstances, the memory of that might be preventing them from moving on and living kind of a fully productive life, and perhaps there is a case in that instance for saying, all right, let's just get that out of the system. I don't know, just wondering.
Maybe.
I just don't think there's there's any way to sort of say, well, it's like what we were saying about science, and this kind of jump on to science as like, this is fact. I don't think there's any way to sort of say whether it's going to be right or wrong.
Very true, very true. And it's also true that we need to move on to the next topic, and it's one of mine. The things that caught my eye this week, and we won't necessarily talk about all of them, were, I don't know if you saw the meteorite hitting an Indian taxi driver. There was which left a bit of a crater, and he was unfortunately killed. And NASA say they don't think it was a meteorite, but I wonder, well, what else causes a little crater, But that just caught my eye, and you can comment on that if you want. Or other stories as well. I thought I'd just mention about Julian Assange, and the UN ruling that ruled in his favour, saying that he is being kept against his will and violating his human rights. And I think they were even sort of suggesting it's illegal, and that he might be able to get compensation. And I do think it really annoys me, this situation. More than £10 million spent on this. It's obviously political. It's not to do with the accusations against him at all. And if he claims compensation, that's going to be even more of a waste of money. So those were the things that caught my eye. Also, we just wanted to quickly mention that I was sort of had a bit of free time, and I thought I'd go back to 24 hours before that Malaysia MH370 disappeared, and just see if there was any news articles that might be connected. And there was 24 hours before MH370 disappeared. There were quite a few articles about the North Korea missile situation, missile launches, which is also a recent occurrence. And there was a near miss with a Southern China Airlines plane. And there was a lot of worry that that a plane could be downed with all these missile launches going on. And North Korea said that they were doing these missile launches in retaliation against the Korean and US military exercises that were going on at that time. And it just made me think, it's basically that Southern China Airlines is the same code share as MH370, so that plane was actually also being labelled as a Southern China Airlines plane. And it just made me think that this could be connected, not necessarily a missile strike, although one of these missiles apparently would have been able to reach Malaysia, but maybe the military drills or something. There was tension at that particular time, 24 hours before a plane goes missing. There's all these articles about what would happen if a plane could go missing because of these missile launches. I thought it was a bit strange. And I also just wanted to quickly mention about the North Korea situation, that something it can't be allowed to continue, this isolation.
I think that I'm hesitant to speculate, but the military maneuvers / North Korean missile theory is not entirely implausible in my view. I don't think that's something that should be entirely ruled out. It certainly should be considered. We know that the search which has been conducted has been massively flawed. We don't know if it's been deliberately tampered with or if it's just kind of a wrong-headed idea to search where they have been searching. We know that there are many possible scenarios that haven't been taken seriously by the search team, and I think this is one of them. I really do. I think, you know, we've seen it happen before. The Korean Airlines 747 that was shot down in the 1980s by a USSR pilot. The Iranian airliner that was shot down by the US, the Italian airliner that was arguably shot down in a dogfight between France and Libya. We've seen it happen. I definitely think it's possible.
We have indeed, and there was also literally the day after the disappearance, China released images of what it said was the downed plane nearer China than anywhere else, or near Vietnam, and I think there is some, as we know, we've talked about this before, there's some suspicious things going on. But the main thing I wanted to talk about today, my main article, was sex robots, strangely enough. I came across an article on the BBC, which is the truth about sex robots. And since we're Truth Sentinel, I thought we need to talk a little bit about this. And basically the article was about how there's a lot of people striving to make sex robots, and robots are in the news a lot these days. It's obvious that in the next sort of 50 to 100 years, robot technology is going to be massive. It's going to change the way we live, and sex robots is one of those changes. And robot partners as well, of course. And in this article, it did mention some of the situations that it may throw up with legalities. With rights for robots. Once we get robots that actually do look like human beings, and at the moment it's very difficult to replicate skin and the feel of skin, but at some point it is quite possible they're going to be able to do that. But with the legalities of equal rights for robots, for example, or whether robots should be able to become heads of states or politicians, whether you can murder a robot, whether you could rape a sex robot, the legalities involved I was more interested in, that things could get very weird indeed. We've already talked about some issues with technology and science that are going to make the future just a very strange situation, and I thought this is another one as well. Sex robots and robot partners and relationships could well become a thing of the future, and in fact a lot of people are saying it's almost a definite. I just wondered what you two thought about that.
Well, first of all, it will happen. I don't think there's much doubt about that. I'm not sure that I could see a situation where a sex robot could attain political office. I think they could run. In fact, I think they may have already run a few, but they didn't run of their own accord. I think there have been a couple of people who have sort of, as a joke, entered like a sex doll into a political race. But I certainly think there are a lot of ethical issues to be discussed around this. For example, you have some people who are saying, look, it's only going to be a matter of time before you get child sex robots. All right. And if you do, what do we think about that? There are two schools of thought on this. One, it's going to encourage pedophiles or validate pedophiles. And another, that it's actually going to give a person who does have an attraction to children an outlet which will obviate the need for them to actually go and have sex with children. And I think that is an absolute minefield. I mean, I don't even know where to begin with that. Those are really serious issues.
They are, and
it's a big area for me as well. Sorry, go on, Scott.
I was going to say, before I go over to Phil, I also wanted to mention something that many people may not be aware of, but there is actually a campaign against sex robots. There's a society that's campaigning against sex robots.
Yep.
I think they're basically saying that sex work is inherently a bad thing, and if you get these sex robots becoming sex workers as well, number one, the sex workers themselves are going to be really annoyed. But this campaign is basically sort of saying that it's going to encourage and encourage the sex industry and objectify women even more. Sorry, Phil,
yeah, they're saying there are parallels between sex robots and prostitution. But are we gonna I mean, we're going to say now that we have a society that doesn't already accept prostitution. I think almost every society on Earth does, whether officially or not.
Again, it's another kind of worrying thing for me, I guess. And like Anthony said, it's an ethical minefield. Like, where do you kind of begin in this? And for me, one of the biggest things is that as soon as human beings start treating something as a resource rather than something as like a part of our world, a part of a living thing that has its own unique purpose here in this world and in life, we get into the area of like we've had slavery for thousands of years. We've had the Nazi Holocaust, and these are just two of the biggest things that where human beings have just seen another human being not as a human being. They've seen them as a something inferior, something less than themselves. And as soon as we do that, as soon as anybody does that, it brings out a really horrible side to humanity, and it brings out the absolute worst in humanity. Some of the worst sort of atrocities in history have happened because of that single issue where we haven't seen something as worthy of the same rights that we believe we're worthy of.
Yeah, and it could be that once people start having relationships with robots and knowing that they're actually not human beings, that humans will start to develop behavior of really not, having less emotion towards this object, and that actually might transfer to other human beings as well. So humans might develop a behavior where they lack empathy and don't care about their partner because they're so used to it with the robots as well.
Or will it develop into a situation where it's just another sexual preference? I don't think we know. I'm not by the way, 100% on the side of the sex robots. That just occurred to me as you were speaking. Perhaps it will end up being just another thing that some people are into and some people are not.
Yeah, and while we're focusing on sex robots, when I was talking about the becoming heads of states, I wasn't necessarily meaning just the sex robot, but robots in general that look like humans. And I just wanted to comment. Some people would argue that we've already got them in power.
Well, there was certainly one. Certainly there was a robot governing California for a while.
The Terminator, or as some people knew him, the Governator. And anyway, I just wanted to say the article about sex robots finished with apparently the second annual Love and Sex with Robots academic conference, which was supposed to be held in Malaysia in November 2015, was declared. The Inspector General of Police there declared the conference illegal, and they had to cancel it abruptly due to circumstances beyond their control. I don't know what that was, but and so it's not going to be held in. It was Malaysia basically, and it's not going to be held there anymore. So they apologised. So if you were heading for the conference, it was cancelled, and I hope you've got over it. But
can you just say the name of the conference again?
The name of the conference was the second annual Love and Sex with Robots academic conference.
Oh my God, why do I never get invited to conferences like this?
I'm sure if they have another one, you could probably buy a ticket.
Yeah, though getting the funding might be interesting. Like putting in the application letter. I want to go to this conference.
Well, imagine
faculty or whatever.
or claiming the expenses afterwards.
Yeah.
It would certainly take a lot of explaining. Anyway, sadly we've reached the end of the show. I just wanted to thank you both for coming on today.
Thank you,
Thanks
Scott.
very much.
It was good. It was a pleasure as always. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Phil, and catch you both next time.
Yep, see you next time.
See you.
So thanks for listening today. Remember, you can leave the voicemails on www.truthsentinel.co.uk. Also leave links in the chat box there. And check out our past episodes. We've got lots of other episodes, about 50 now, I think, on YouTube. So find us at Truth Sentinel with Scott. If you type that into YouTube, you should find us. There's 2 channels, actually. If you subscribe to us, then you'll never miss an episode. But also listen to us on the digital networks, which you can find at the bottom of the website, www.truthsentinel.co.uk. Remember also that you can buy t-shirts on there at www.trutht-shirts.com. Use the code TRUTH1 to get your special Truth Sentinel discount of 10%, and we get a small donation. Have a good week, and please join us again for our next episode. Thank you. Goodbye.